You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet.
I was put in a medically induced coma, and on the 5th of April, they told my family that I was going to die and there was nothing that they could do for me. But the nurses and the doctors at the hospital I was at had already had one of my fellow employees die from COVID-19, and they weren't going to take that lying down.
You're listening to Mathieu Burdon, Public Safety Diving Team Leader, Tech Dive Instructor, VIP Patron supporter of Speaking Sidemount, and survivor of a serious infection of COVID-19. Matt is our VIP Patron of the Month, and he graciously joined me to share in detail his experiences contracting COVID-19, from the knowledge that it had infected his workplace to seeing a colleague die to his own battle with COVID-19, including 17 days in a coma. Matt's story is both frightening and inspiring. You'll hear about his symptoms, admission to hospital and intensive care, his family and friends being told that he won't make it, to the medical team pulling out all the stops and saving his life. Matt talks about the after effects, his rehab and his path back to diving, and then Matt and I share our thoughts on the global pandemic, the responses of various countries around the world, and Matt's advice to any divers out there who contract COVID-19. This episode is a must-listen for all divers, and huge thanks again to Matt, to X-Deep for their support of Speaking Sidemount, and to our growing Patreon community who graciously contribute to the production of each and every episode. If you want to know more about how you can support Speaking Sidemount, then go to www.patreon.com/speakingsidemount. There you'll find all of the support levels and the benefits that patrons receive, including premium episodes, bonus videos, live stream, and your chance to be our VIP Patron of the Month and join me on the show. And so on with this episode, Mathieu Burdon on surviving COVID-19. So Mathieu, welcome to Speaking Sidemount. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Now, you're the June VIP Patron of the Month, which is just awesome from my point of view. I'm really grateful for your support. What prompted you to become a patron of Speaking Sidemount?
I had listened to all the podcasts from episode 1, and it just seemed like the right thing to do. I researched doing my own podcast and really realized how much went into that as far as the expense of everything, continuous software updates and equipment, hardware updates. And I just thought it was the right thing to do because I was listening to it and I had an interest in it. And it was a podcast I was going to continue to do.
Yeah, thanks so much. I do appreciate it. And you're absolutely correct. It's just, I don't think many people comprehend what it takes to put an episode out even. You know, it's quite funny. I have a coffee shop, which is my main business, and it takes me about 90 seconds to make a $5 coffee. And to produce an episode, especially the premium ones that are also $5 per month, that takes me almost a full week of work. So around 40 hours by the time I've booked an interview and done the interview and edited and done the production and done the promotions for it. So it's no small thing. So I'm very, very appreciative to everyone who supports, and I don't take it for granted by any means. So thank you very much. Now, obviously you're a diver, so tell us a bit about your diving.
So I began diving in 1990 when I was stationed in the Army. And even before that, I was interested. My dad was a diver in the 60s. He got out of it because, back then, a lot of people were dying from diving and equipment wasn't where it is today or even where it was in 1990. So when I made my own money and I could afford things while I was in the Army, I started diving recreationally. Then I moved back home to California, met my first mentor, and she really got me into California diving because I dove in Colorado in springs and lakes, and it was totally different than diving in the cold waters of California.
Yeah.
Then I went up through the ranks and did all these classes and everything else. In 1992, I joined the Sheriff's Department out here in California, one of them. In 2003, I had the opportunity to join their dive team. but I was a sergeant. So they said, hey, you have to be a dive master to be on the team. And so I went through all those courses and enjoyed actually working with students, and even students who were having problems and stuff. Then I became an instructor. But I was always interested in technical diving, and I really wanted to get into the technical side of things. And so after I did some research and everything else, one of the people on the sheriff's team was a cave diver, and he wanted me and a few other the guys on the team to go to cave school. And so we did. We did the whole Zero to Hero thing in
Awesome.
Florida. Everything kind of just took off from there. I just love diving, and especially the technical side of it. I really got into that. And then, of course, once you start cave diving, you start getting into sidemount diving.
Yeah. And it's very addictive, isn't it? This whole thing of being able to manage equipment, prepare equipment, take it into an environment that really needs it. It's a very compelling thing once you're into it.
Right, exactly. And my background and everything else, I'm very much into like rules. And so setting up gear a certain way, procedures, checklists, all that stuff, that was in my niche. And I know it sounds weird, but I just really enjoyed that side of diving.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't understand cave diving and how addictive it does get, but go in a beautiful forest and hike around, and that's what I always tell people.
Yeah, exactly.
What cave diving is.
Yeah, I think people see it as kind of this adrenaline sport where you're risking your life every time you go in. And I read an interesting article from Steve Bogarts just the other day about, it's really not like that. I mean, you should feel some fear, and a lot of it is about controlling that fear. But realistically, it's about going into an environment that requires a lot of discipline, a lot of diligence, a lot of process, equipment, procedure, and then safely conducting a dive by following those rules that our forebears, Chick Exley and others, have developed for us such that we can cave dive safely. So while there are risks, it's certainly not the adrenaline sport that some people think it is.
Right. And the other thing I appreciate about it is the social aspect of it.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, there's politics in it and everything else, but there's politics in everything we do in everyday life. But like when I hang out with my guy friends, and there's some girlfriends there too, obviously, but it's just very social. When we're done diving for the day, it's just very social aspect. And I think that's where I got the addiction. I mean, I still enjoy going into a cave. I still enjoy going into overhead environments, but it's very methodical. When I go into a new place, I have a little bit of adrenaline, like you said, but I guess it's confidence in your skills and your abilities, your equipment. It just makes it easy.
Yeah, exactly. I have a saying too, there's two things that divers love. They love diving and they like talking shit about diving.
Yeah.
It's kind of, so that social aspect is kind of very closely behind. I remember my times in Gozo, and even in New Zealand, it doesn't matter where you go. We used to go diving for a day and we'd do these amazing dives, and then we'd sit around a table and just talk about it, have a beer or a coffee or whatever your thing is. But it was always fun to be able to talk about what you did. And some of it was debriefing, so some of it was kind of part of the process. But a lot of it was just talking in general and sharing time together. And it is a great camaraderie that you have around divers, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, one of the things, and if I can, I'll back up a little bit. So when my instruction prior to going to cave school consisted of 2 hours in a pool with a set of doubles. And that was it. And then I didn't have any technical background or anything else. And once I got cave certified, I thought the training was intense, but I was always in deco and I didn't know what that meant. I really didn't. I mean, I had an old VR3 computer and it showed me the little diver on the string, but I really didn't understand that. The instructor's like, yeah, just breathe off this. And I'm like, never again, because although I enjoyed it, I thought it was lacking in certain things. And I just listened to the Brandon interview you did on episode 51, and it rings true. What he said is like, yeah, you can self-teach yourself to be a sidemount diver, but how do we get better? That's one of the things I did when I got back. First thing I did was I just dropped the money and got all my technical training all the way up to open circuit trimix. And then I started diving that and learning the ins and outs for myself. Yeah. And then after a time period, I said, okay, I'm ready to be a technical instructor, I think. And I went through all that process. And after I went through that process, I said, I'm never going to allow anybody on my team to ever do that again. Good. And I started a mentor class, not a certification class. Kind of what other of your guests have said is that we need to start mentoring people. They told me, hey, we're going cave training in January. And the January before, we were doing a mentor class, really teaching them how to wear a twin set, as you all say, really let them find their balance with it underwater, really trimming them out. And then when I became a tech instructor, I just started offering courses with that so that they could understand decompression and things like that. I thought that was very important because it's not really required when you go to cave school. And it's just like what Brendan was talking about on that other episode was nobody ever asked for a side mount card. And sometimes nobody asks for a card when they get 100% O2. Because then I started leading the Sheriff's Department dive team. And I really wanted my guys to be safe. You know, I really wanted them to do it because I think it's a valuable training tool, but I also wanted them to do it safe. So mentoring is a big deal.
Yeah, and a few of my guests have talked about that. And one thing that brings me back to is the way that the cave diving group in the UK train. They're this famed group from the Thai Cave Rescue now, but there's no course there. It's a year of mentoring. And you do it with more than one person and you spend time with them and you go on dives with them and you talk through equipment, you make your own decisions. So there's not specific training involved. It's very much a mentoring program. And I think there's a lot of value in that. You know, whether it's outside of your courses, before your courses, as you're mentioning, I think it's a really, really valuable thing. And if the listeners can take anything away from this, I think if you can find a really good mentor, somebody who's a good, strong, high-level diver that you can dive with and can ask questions. I mean, I have them here now. In fact, I've got a good friend. He's New Zealand's top rebreather diver right now. I'm new to rebreather diving, and he is so kindly sharing his time to help me with a bunch of things because I'm a long way from supply lines in terms of my training. So I'm very grateful for that, you know, and you can't take it for granted if somebody's doing you a favor, right, when they're mentoring you. So you've got to make sure you give back. I will and have done that, but it's such a valuable thing to have, and I'm so appreciative of the mentoring that I'm getting now and that I've had in the past. So it's a great tip. Well, let's move on. I know recently you had a very serious infection from COVID-19, and obviously we're in the midst of a global pandemic. As our Prime Minister is warning us here in New Zealand, is this thing is growing, not slowing, and we need to take it really seriously. And there are people around the world who are, and there's many who aren't. But look, given that you've had more than a brush with it, can you share something about your experience and how did you get infected and what happened?
I'll tell you the whole story if it doesn't bore anybody. So currently I'm still employed by a major sheriff's department here in California. Currently I'm a lieutenant assigned to one of the jails. And because we're in such close proximity with one another, it came in the facility and it spread like wildfire, even though we were doing everything that they told us to do personally and on a global scale in the facility. Like we were cleaning everything. We were wearing PPE. We were washing our hands all the time, but it's a jail and you're opening and closing doors and you're in close proximity. And a few of my workers got it. And on the 28th of March, I started having symptoms. I got a really bad fever. I knew I had it. And my commander was pretty on top of things. He was telling people, we'll send you home. We're going to do everything we can to try to mitigate the problem. Unfortunately, I got it. I got tested and I never really heard the results of that, but I didn't have some of the symptoms that they said. And this is a point I'd like to talk about is that, you know, everybody talks about the shortness of breath and the dry cough and the fever, but there are so many other symptoms associated. Like just had a friend who got diagnosed a week ago. And of course, people have been calling me once they get diagnosed, and he didn't have shortness of breath or a cough either, but he had a headache, really bad, intense headache, and he had a fever. So there's other symptoms there, but another one that seems to be there is an intense headache. I mean, my son had the intense headache too. He eventually got it as well. I didn't know that until much, much later that he had gotten it. But we couldn't control the fever, and they were telling us not to use ibuprofen products, and so we could only use Tylenol. And then finally my doctor said, hey, since we can't control the fever, let's do 2 hours of ibuprofen, 2 hours of Tylenol. And he said there was conflicting reports within the medical community globally on that. And so we did that and still couldn't control the fever. And so he said, sorry, you're going to have to go to the emergency room. So on the 1st of April, I went to the emergency room and I got admitted within 45 minutes into ICU. My O2 sets were in the 80s and they put me on 5 liters of O2 continuous, and I still really couldn't get my O2 stats up. but I didn't feel like I was short of breath. They did a chest x-ray and you could really see the outlines of my lungs. They were pure white. And so they put me up in ICU immediately. And on the 3rd of April, I was put on a ventilator and put in a COVID room or ward in the hospital. I was put in a medically induced coma. And on the 5th of April, they told my family that I was going to die and there was nothing that they could do for me. But the nurses and the doctors at the hospital I was at had already had one of my fellow employees die from COVID-19, and they weren't going to take that lying down. And they didn't. They put me in a roto bed. And so I went from a supine position to a prone position. And once I did that, my O2 saturation levels had come up into the 90s. And I think that that's an important thing to share. And they were turning me manually, but it was like dead weight. And plus they were trying to keep all the tubes inside of me at the same time while they were turning me. So once they put me in this bed, it got easier for the hospital and for me, even though I didn't know it. So I was on a ventilator for 17 days. And during that time, they had given me mass amounts of antibiotics and antivirals in order to keep me alive. They were trying everything because we don't know a lot about this virus. I mean, we're learning little bits every day, but the medical community is trying. So after 17 days, they tried taking me off the ventilator and it worked, but they didn't wake me up. So I was in PCU for another 5 days. I would wake up a little bit here and there, and I slept for basically another 5 days. My body was just still recovering from it. And because I'd been in the hospital for so long, and when I finally was awake, they tried to get me to stand up and walk and stuff, and I couldn't. I could stand up for like 20 seconds, but every time they tried to tell me to walk, I just couldn't. So they put me in a rehabilitation hospital, and they told me I'd be there 3 weeks. I was there a day, and I was joking around with the nurses. I thought it was funny to joke around all the time. I was joking around with anybody, and I just told them I was going to leave Tuesday, and they just kept laughing at me. And I was put in on Saturday, and I just kept saying, I'll be out here Tuesday. And then I don't know what got into me. All my friends who will eventually listen to this will know what got into me. They'll just say, because I was a stubborn son of a bitch. But they came to me a couple days later, and I'd already been walking with the parallel bars, in case I lost my balance. And I was doing steps and stuff. And I just said, I'm not going to get in a wheelchair. I told the nurse one day, I'm just not getting in a wheelchair. I said, I know where the gym is. Let's walk. And she goes, you're going to use a walker. I said, I don't care if I use a walker or what, but I'm not getting in that wheelchair again. 7 days later, I was out walking on my own. Still had problems with stamina, I would say, but
sure.
As far as strength, I was out in 7 days. Since then, it's been a lot of rehabilitation, a lot of specialists, and occupational therapy. I've got the cardiologist to sign me off so far. I've got the psychologist to sign me off so far because they were worried that I would have, PTSD from. I don't feel like I went through it because I was in a coma. I'm not trying to be cavalier about it because certainly my friends and family went through it.
Sure.
But I didn't go through the worst of it and everything else. But ever since I've been home, I've been walking, I've been in physical therapy, doing all the weights and bands, resistance bands and all that stuff. And I'm trying to learn how to ride again with my fine motor skills, and that's getting a lot better. I still have some tremoring on my right hand. It's interesting because my left side's a lot stronger than my right side, and my right side's my dominant side. But I have no pulmonary issues at all, which is great. My primary care physician is very confident I will go back to diving, hopefully within 6 months or less. And if you would have seen me coming out of the hospital on May 2nd to where we are today, which is the 18th of June, some people have said, hey, we would have never known you were sick.
Yeah, it's immense. And the lingering after effects, is this a combination of COVID and being on a ventilator, or is a lot of this due to the fact that you're on a ventilator for 17 days?
All the above. Right. COVID obviously took my O2 saturations down to 74%, which made me hypoxic, which caused some brain issues. My neurologist has said, we don't believe it's permanent damage, but you're going to have to learn to redo some things. So I have some problems with speech, and I'm sure if I go back and listen to this recording, there's going to be parts in there where I pause or lose a little track where I'm trying to remember the right word to say or such, but that's retraining my brain. I have a little problem with writing right now, although it's getting better. So that's due to COVID. My tongue is numb and I have a sinus issue where they put the feeding tube and my tongue is numb because of where they put the ventilator. That had to do with the ventilator issue. So it's a combination of all of it. They think my white blood cells are down because of all the antivirals they put me on. So now they're really concerned about secondary infection stuff and all that.
It's such an immense story, and what your family must have gone through too, to be sitting there watching you. As you say, it's incredibly traumatic, and so many people have lost their lives. And a lot of people think it's just an old person's disease. Right. And certainly our elderly populations have been severely impacted. So it's not that they haven't been, but you're by no means old. So it's certainly able to affect others as well.
Yeah, right. And one of my main concerns when I woke up, and I didn't find out how bad off I was until I was in the rehabilitation hospital and one of the nurses let it slip. My family didn't want to tell me how bad it was. My friends didn't want to tell me how bad it was because they didn't want me to get upset. They just wanted me to focus on getting better. So yeah, the family went through a lot. But the other thing about the family is it's COVID-19. So guess who cannot come to any of the hospitals and visit you?
Yeah, your family.
And that's a vital thing to try to get better. Your family and friends. So when I was in the rehabilitation hospital, they put me in a room that had a window on the first floor. And my friends and family would go outside that window and we would talk on speakerphones to one another.
Oh, that's amazing. So, yeah, it's tough, because, you want to protect everybody from getting infected, but at the same time, you're separating loved ones at a time when they need each other the most. We have a big thing going on in New Zealand right now. We'd smacked it down in this country, which is immense. So we'd had no infections for 24 days, 0. So everybody's well. The borders are closed, though, and we always knew our borders were our next risk. We allowed 2 people to come in for compassionate reasons. They were going to see, I think it was a dying parent or they'd just passed away. So you can understand the trauma that they were going through. And it wasn't their fault, but they were allowed to pass through and they were both infected. So here we are, the country's clean, and now we've just allowed 2 people back in. So the military's taken over the quarantine and border control. So that's good, but it just goes to show how on top of this we have to be. And, we're fortunate we're an island in the corner of the globe, and we've done a fantastic job as a country of taking care of this. But, we have to realize that this is still raging and it has to be taken seriously.
Yeah, somebody who had it, I have a different viewpoint on other people who talk about it. I mean, I was at the dive shop the other day, and I was the first person 5 people ever met who had gotten infected with COVID. And it was interesting to see their reactions. I'm like, hey, I don't have it anymore, but a lot of people don't know people who have had it. So they're not really taking it serious because of that. I took it serious because it was my work, but I still got it.
Yeah. So I remember being part of the fraternity. I'm embarrassed now, but I guess it was just ignorance. I remember January, February saying, hey, it's just the flu. Yeah, a bunch of people are going to get sick. It's not a big deal. And it was only really when we started to get some serious infections and we saw what was going on in Italy from afar. And we thought, crap, if this has happened in Italy, this can happen to us. Thankfully, our government got hold of it. And I do remember I had to stop because Facebook was starting to really piss me off, because there were good friends of mine as well. We're kind of, in my mind, we're prioritizing the economy over the welfare of our people. And look, they're both important and they do go hand in hand, but we've got to remember how dangerous this really is and how infectious it really is. How has your opinion changed from before you became infected to after?
That's the question I get asked the most. I will say this. I was in Palau in February. And when they let me into Palau, they took my temperature and had me fill out all these forms and everything else, my son and I rolled my eyes. I really did. I was like, I don't think it's a myth, but people were saying, and I was getting all my information from social media and the news. And, there were commentators on both sides. Oh, this is really serious. And this is a farce. You got that dynamic. And my opinion is, obviously, it's real, because depending on who you talk to, I had a 1% chance of living or a 20% chance of living. And those still aren't good odds to me, either of those numbers. I believe that It's a combination of both. People have had very minor cold symptoms to death and everything in between. And so it's a really, like I said in the beginning, this is a strange virus and a strange disease because it doesn't impact everybody the exact same way. And so my opinion is that we all need to quit fighting about it and we need to come up with true solutions. But like I said, also in the beginning, everybody wants to politicize everything. And that's what I have a problem with. I think we should be able to open up limited stuff. I think that we have to take precautions because we just don't know. We took all the precautions we did at my work, and, I won't give out the exact number, but I can tell you that over a third of the employees got it. We washed everything. It was like we decontaminated cells and cell door handles and everything. And we took every single precaution. I see my friends in the dive industry losing their livelihood and their transportation, their house, their apartment, what have you. I'm really concerned about the boat operators here off the coast of California.
Absolutely.
And so it's really not an easy question to answer. I don't mind personally. For example, I'm an instructor, a tech instructor, and they just opened up some of the dive boats here, but only at 50%. And so now us instructors, we now have to pay to go teach. I don't mind doing that if it means that my friend Laura, the boat captain, can stay employed.
100%.
She's doing everything she can to keep her boat clean. I mean, you should see the list of stuff she has to do, but she's willing to do it. And I do think that until we get a vaccine and until we see the numbers really go down, that's what we need to do.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. In terms of government responses and in terms of what can be done, there's been a dichotomy across the world, right? You've had everything from Sweden at one end, where pretty much haven't done very much at all and said, hey, let's go for herd immunity. I think they've acknowledged they should have done a better job at looking after their aged care facilities. But outside of that, it's been their approach and they'll live with whatever the results are. Yeah, we're probably at the other end of the spectrum where we did lock down. We locked down for 49 days and basically got rid of the virus. It's not eradicated. They've used the word eliminated, which means that it's gone, but it could come back. But our borders are closed and New Zealand as a country relies on tourism. It's our biggest exporter. So that's a huge problem for many businesses. And you mentioned the dive industry. We had exactly the same thing. So all the way through lockdown, all of our dive operators were some of the most affected. But now, thanks to what we did, everybody's able to operate. We just don't have international tourists. So what we've got to do is what you just suggested. We have to get out and dive, and that's what we've been doing. We've been working really hard to try and support our local operators and try and help them to stay in business. And we're starting to make some impact on that, but it's not going to be the same as having tourists here as well. But I do contrast that. I lived in the States for many, many years. I know the country reasonably well as somebody who lived in Northern California. I've dived Catalina Island many times. I've dived Santa Cruz Islands from Santa Barbara. I find it really interesting with the States because it's such a different circumstance to what either Sweden or New Zealand has gone through. And whether you criticize the government's management of it or not, I don't know whether it would have mattered who was in power and who was controlling things in America because it's such a huge nation. There's 50 states. Every state has its own controls. To get America to agree to one thing, I don't think is even possible. If you said, hey, we're going to lock down like New Zealand did, probably a large number of states would have said, no, I'm not going to do that. And as soon as one state doesn't do it, it doesn't work anymore. I think the best thing America could have done is said, hey, listen, let's fortify our healthcare systems and put all of this money into healthcare so that we can make sure that when somebody turns up and that they're sick, that we can take the best care of them. And let's send out a whole lot of recommendations to the nation on here's how you should social distance, here's how you should wear a mask, here's the protections you can make. Because I don't think there was really going to be another answer for America compared to us. We did have another option, I think. And I don't know how you feel about that. And it is quite political saying that. But the criticism that falls on the states for the way they've managed it, as someone who lived there, I don't know whether you could have done it another way. What's your opinion on that?
I 100% agree with you. There's a very good TED Talk by Bill Gates where he says that what's going to destroy America is a pandemic. And that was in 2014. Yeah. So in 2014, you had this guy. And if you go back and look at that TED Talk by Bill Gates, he says, we're not prepared. That's in 2014. Here we are 6 years later. We've had two different types of government during those 6 years.
Mm.
We currently have this conservative government, and then we had a liberal government. And he got all of his research even before 2014. So I agree with you. I don't think it should be political. It doesn't matter who was in power. Other concerns took a higher priority in the whole scheme of government. I think you're 100% right. I mean, you look at what we call the red states here. They're kind of, I wouldn't say anti-government, but they want more freedom. You're right. You're not going to be able to travel from Arizona unless we close the borders of California. That's the only way. You can't keep people in their states. There was still commerce going on.
The great strength of America is the freedoms, but in this case, it becomes the weakness because you just can't dictate anything. You can't tell people what to do in America, right? It doesn't work. That's not a criticism again. It's just saying that this is the way it is. You just have to acknowledge it and say, okay, well, this is going to be the best course of action given the nature of this country. And as I said, New Zealand is so weird in that sense because we're quite a liberal country, I have to say, and we do trust our government. And I think there are important characteristics. So when the government said to us, hey, listen, this is a pandemic. We've taken the best advice we can get. And we've got a really good Prime Minister. I mean, she's just a great communicator and very clear thinker. And she just stood up with the experts and said, this is what we have to do. You guys have to do it. And everyone went, okay, fair enough. We'll do it. And there was a bit of dissent, but we locked down and we were able to do that. Not everyone can do it.
Right. And I think that for us, we locked down too. I mean, I particularly don't like the governor of my state, but I will say that the information that came out made sense about flattening the curve and everything else. And it just made sense because you didn't want to overwhelm the hospitals. And that made sense. And when it makes sense, you just do it, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum. You're right. There's all this talk. There's some dissent and, oh, it's just a really bad cold. That was what the dissenters were saying. But you're right. You just do it. And if it worked, yeah, there's going to be a bump to the economy. I get that, but we'll recover. We've recovered from a Great Depression. We'll recover. I have faith in my country that we will recover. Even my friends who I would say were really conservative were saying, yeah, it makes sense, you know. But
I think about it a lot from the point of view of the Second World War. My grandparents went through the bombings in London and my grandfather served for the Royal Navy and was sunk 3 times, unfortunately, and lived through that. And my grandmother had to move my mother to Scotland to escape the bombing. If they can get through that, I can get through this, regardless of what it brings. And so I spoke to Matt Jivon about his experience with COVID, and he's a psychologist. And he said it's important to acknowledge the damage and acknowledge what the bad things that are coming on and look them in the eye. But at the same time, it's really important to count your blessings and then put it in perspective, paint a picture around this where, yeah, hey, things are going to be okay. And as you say, yeah, we will get through this. And it's going to take some time and things will be different for a while. You know, the trip to Palau, my trip to Truck was cancelled, you know, so I'm going to have to deal with that.
I'm supposed to go in March of 2021, so we'll see.
Maybe. Well, we might be there the same time by the sounds of it.
Okay. I'll buy you a pint.
Thank you. I'll appreciate that. I don't know if you've been to Truck before, but depending on where you go, it's fantastic. And yeah, it's well worth the visit. Well, look, that has given us an immense perspective on COVID from someone who's really been close to it, both from the point of view being affected yourself, but being in a workplace where others have been affected too. We'd call that a cluster. And so the knowledge that you've passed on there is immense. Is there anything else that you want to share about it in terms of your perspective and views?
No, I just think that there's a reason why medical experts are giving us the precautions we're supposed to use. And I just think we need to follow them until there's a vaccine. And if you have the symptoms and you can Google them or whatever, definitely go get tested and definitely quarantine yourself. And if need be, I know it's hard with these economic times, but get your family tested. And if they're not positive, let them go stay in a hotel or something, because we had to totally have a medical cleaning company come in and clean our house. So to disinfect it so that nobody coming here, or my mother-in-law lives with me and she did not get it. And we were really concerned about that. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, very good advice. Thanks very much. Well, look, I mean, we've got an opportunity to talk about sidemount diving for a little while now as well. So yeah, let's do that. So let's start with you. Is there anything that you want to know or want to ask, or is there something in your diving that you'd like to sort of review or go over? Or
I just think that for me, sidemount diving was because of overhead environments. But the more I travel to do technical dives, the more I believe that it's a better tool, because it's hard to find banded manifold doubles anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to do a tech trip like truck, my friends and were going to dive side mount, do setup dives, and because they have aluminums and, well, I always dive dry unless I'm going to some place where it's over 80 degrees. But you have to start doing setup dives with aluminums, because we're not used to diving aluminum cylinders, but that's all they have. So
Yep.
I think that's an important thing. Training, like I said before, the education of a man ceases the day he dies. I don't care if you're a technical side mount instructor.
Mm-hmm.
You should still be training. You should still be going to those guys like Brian Kachuk and Ed Swanson. I mean, I just took a class from Ed a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
I took a DPV cave class with him.
Me too.
I would say it ended up being a DPV/side mount class. One of the things I learned from Ed is that don't be afraid to do mods.
No. Yeah.
I always heard it, always on the forums and everything. Oh, this side mount kit with the Ed mods, that's what you need. And I never understood what it meant until I actually talked to the man. And yeah, I think it was a really good thing. And, when I'm teaching my students, we look at every piece of the harness, the wing, and what have you, with all the different setups we have, all the different manufacturers, and we see what's good for your body type and how to shorten up the loops. Or I really enjoy side mount diving. Whereas before I was like, nope, if it's open water, I'm on back mount. And if it's overhead environment, I'm on side mount. That's slowly going away. It's just easier. I just find the trim to be better. Once you dial it in, the trim is better. The ability to reach your regs, the ability to reach the valves, it's all easier. But I don't believe that I should stop learning. That's why I'm contributing to the podcast any way I can, because
thank you.
The big ones for me have been Standard Clop. That was a good one for me. I've already talked to Ed a couple times because I'm a public safety diver, and Ed has also done recoveries. And so we had a lot of discussion during training about the importance of knowing your limits, especially as a recovery diver and somebody who ran a recovery team. Those were some very good conversations. You had the gentleman on the Thai rescue, and
Richard Harris.
I don't think people really realize what he and his cohorts went through to be in an overhead environment like that. And when you do a recovery, you try your best to not damage the person, but that's a rescue. That's a totally different animal, and it's overhead environment, and they're young, not scuba certified.
It's so immense. And actually, a friend of mine reached out to me and complimented me on that episode. He just listened to it for the first time. And it is just immense, that conversation I had with him. But the follow-up one with Chris Jewell, I really enjoyed as well, because Chris had that, what you would call scary moment of losing the line while having a kid under his arm. Talk about that a lot. Because not only did they find the kids in the first place, right? So they had to lay rope. It's not normal cave line. They laid rope because of the flow in there. They found the kids. They had to take a bend and make a choice of which way were they going to go. So they guessed where the kids might be based on which was the best part of the cave to visit. And then they dived in there. They found them. They realized that they had a big problem on their hands. But that dive was passing sumps. So it's not just diving. It's diving, getting out of the water, carrying your gear across a dry section, getting back into the water, and doing that a number of times. It had gnarly vertical restrictions in it as well. Very limited visibility. In the beginning, extremely high flow. So as a cave diver, we already know that if there was no children in there and we were just going to do this dive, this was already going to be really challenging without thinking about this as a rescue. And then to go through, to find the kids, to come up with a plan to anesthetize them, to have Harry say, no way under the sun am I going to anesthetize a child and push their head under the water. Then for him to go and do it, realizing there was no other way to save these kids. And then knowing that doing it was probably going to kill them, and the impact on them personally and also professionally. And then to actually do it, it's just amazing. I know there's movies coming out, and there's been a few documentaries, but if they do make a feature film of this, I hope they do it justice, because we throw the word hero around kind of lightly sometimes, and I can't think of a story even remotely like that.
Totally agree. I took a cave recovery class from Lamar Hires, and I can't even imagine doing that in real life, let alone training, after I went through the training. So I believe that, and a cave they've never been into, zero viz. I mean, I just can't even imagine. But anyway, when I talk to Ed, I talk to all these men and women that I can, and I listen to you just learn something from every one of them. And I have when I listen to the podcast, I have this moleskin book, and I just write down good points to bring into my next classes. And I've done an extreme amount of research on cave diving deaths and technical diving deaths, and done accident analysis on my own. And that's one good thing about California. Well, even I got all the medical examiner's reports out of Australia on Angie's death. I really think as a profession, sometimes we don't like to talk about that because it's a good time business. But when you get in the technical diving field and side mounting, and you're going to go in overheads, whether it's wrecks or caves, I think you need to talk about that.
Well, we do. And what's interesting about that is often when there's a fatality, the story goes untold because the only person who really knows what happened was the person who died, and if there wasn't another person around at the time, then it's kind of difficult to decipher exactly what the scenario was. And we can kind of get glimpses of it, but not the real story. And I just contributed to a book by Stratus Cass called Close Calls, which is coming out, which is a whole lot of prominent divers around the world were asked to share stories of where they've had a near miss. And I think we can learn so much from near misses. When that book comes out, please look out for it. I know Steve Bogarts is in there, pretty sure Chris Jules in there, Christina Zanato, I think, as well. There's a bunch of really, really great divers in there. And we've all got a story, of a time when either we made a mistake or we'd gone beyond where we should have gone, or a combination of all of the above, and got ourselves into trouble. And then obviously we're still around, so somehow we got ourselves out of it. And whether that was by good luck, good management, or a combination, it's worth knowing that happened. And without a doubt, the biggest thing that I'm sure will come out in all of them is that the mental side of diving is so important. It's not what happens, it's how you mentally deal with it, and that you have a mental process that allows you to calm your mind and then move yourself step by step back from the point. It's cool stuff. And I compliment you on your ethos of wanting to learn all of the time, because I think it is important. And I say it a lot about diving too. Every dive's a training dive. You've got to have fun. So let's not ignore that. But at the same time, every dive I've got some training goal in mind. I want to be a little bit better at this or a little bit better at that, or I'm going to accomplish a specific skill that I need to practice or that I want to practice or perfect.
It's like one of the things when you put together a tech team is, we don't talk enough about mission, or under the mission category, maybe we don't talk about what skills do we want to practice. And from all different agencies, I had some really good instructors. And I would say one of my instructors called it, hey, we're going to have a party during this dive. And it's where there's all these failures that happen and how we react to them and how we prioritize them. If you lose a fin and you're out of air at the same time, you better be prioritizing one. But it's amazing under panic that people will go for the fin and not signal to their buddy that they're out of air, so that constant training is really, again, what I like about side mount diving, because we're always doing all these failures during our training, and it's invaluable. Because if you go dive Palau with your son and you have an incident, you're just calm. It wasn't a big incident, but it was on our very last dive of the day in heavy current. And probably boring to talk about, but it's just how calm you are while you're running out of air and stuff to get you unfouled and get up to the surface safely. And I think it comes down to all the training I've had, especially the advanced training such as cave diving and all my technical diving. It's like some outfitters, like I went to North Carolina and went wreck diving, and they see all these yahoos come on with side mount rigs, and they're like, these are a bunch of yahoos who don't know anything. And then finally, when we come up, it's like, we just want the extra gas, man. We've never dove here. We never dove here. We don't know what it's like. We're going to do limited penetration at first, but if we have an issue, and they're recreational depths, it's recreational time, but we just have the extra gas.
Same thing, I dive it all the time, and I just dive it because it's the way I prefer to dive. And I've got a couple of 7-litre cylinders, which are 50 cubic feet now. That's a way to overcome that too, is try smaller cylinders, try a couple of 50s. They're actually hugely fun to dive. It's more gas than a single, but it's redundant. And it's a lot of fun. So I'd recommend trying that if you're doing some more recreational stuff and you don't need all of the gas, but you want the redundancy, then there's an opportunity to do that. I often dive my 12 litres. I don't know what that's 95 cubic feet, I think. I'll be doing an easy sub 30 metre dive, sub 100 foot dive. I feel balanced. I feel calm, controlled. So it's the way I like to dive. Sir, thank you very much. Was there anything else that you wanted to ask?
I would love to go to New Zealand. I think it's on my list now. After listening to one of your, when we did the Patreon thing, and go out there and dive, I think it'd be a lot like California diving, actually.
It's quite similar. So we have, California has giant kelp. We have a similar looking kelp species, but much smaller, but we have a lot of kelp beds. So it does look quite similar to California diving, but we've got just a little bit like Catalina. We've got an amazing marine reserve at the Poor Knights Islands, which Jacques Cousteau, some of the dive sites he called in the top 10 in the world. But Jacques had about 100 top 10s in the world. He was a very generous man when he visited. He understood how to be a good guest, but it is amazing diving. And on its day, it's as good as anything I've ever done, particularly if you love marine life. And it's quite different to what you see in other parts of the world. And then the other places I love to dive is the Bay of Islands. And that's where the Canterbury wreck is, that people have heard me mention many times. And it's a wonderful purpose sunk wreck. And then for the more adventurous, if you really want to do some serious technical type dives, there's depth at the Poor Knights for sure. And there's depth in the Bay of Islands, but in the South Island, there's the Mikhail Lermontov, a Russian cruise liner that one of our pilots made a major mistake and took it through a gap it could never go through and tore the bottom out of it and sunk it. So we're somewhat grateful in the dive community now because it's an immense dive wreck on its side, beautiful cruise liner, and very gnarly, coldish water and not great visibility outside of the wreck and very silty inside. So it's a extremely challenging wreck dive, and I'm looking forward to going back and doing that one again, maybe this year, given that we can't travel. So there's some nice diving. And then on top of that, it's a pretty cool place to visit in terms of other activities that people might want to do here. It's a country of contrast. The North Island, South Island's very, very different from each other. So there's a lot to see, a lot to do. The food's good. People are pretty friendly most of the time. So tourism's our big thing. So once the borders open again, hopefully 2021 or sometime then, and as you say, after a vaccine comes, I think is when that's likely. Because poor Kiwis, not many of us have even, you mentioned that no one that you knew has had it. We've only had about 1,500 cases in the whole country. So not many people, certainly no one in my part of New Zealand has had it in the far north here. We certainly have no immunity whatsoever. So we'll be waiting for that vaccine and hopefully it can be done.
You know what? Something just came to mind, if you don't mind me, about going back to COVID-19 is that all my friends and family, I think one of the reasons why they were so concerned, because they know how much diving is a huge part of my life. And we sat the doctor down and we said, just give it to me straight. I want to know now. Because there's some conflicting information out there with Dan and the medical community about diving and COVID. There's some stuff out of Europe. Mike Meduno called me and wanted to talk to me about that too, because he writes for Dan Europe. And so I would just say this: if you get COVID, it doesn't mean that you have to stop diving. There's a bunch of factors that go into it. It's just like with any other virus you get or disease you get. You just have to trust the medical professionals, but you can always get a second opinion. And so I think there's a lot of bad information. I almost died. I obviously had double pneumonia on top of it, caused by the COVID virus. And there's no residual damage in my lungs, which is a big thing I think people need to understand. As long as there's no residual damage in the lungs and you're consulting with your doctor and everything else, it doesn't mean your diving thing is over. And that was a huge thing for me.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, I think back to the PJ Prinsloo episode that as a patron you will have got, it's one of the premium episodes, but he had a major car accident and was told he couldn't dive after that. So he gave up diving for, I think it was a year or two, but then eventually he just said, look, stuff it, I'm going diving. He went back and saw a doctor again and said, hey, what do you think? 2 years later, and they said, well, okay, we'll take it easy. Before you know it, he's cave diving and technical diving. But the bottom line is that our bodies, as you've proven, our bodies are amazing at recovering. And what is a prognosis at one point in time doesn't necessarily mean you can't dive again for the rest of your life, for instance. And so it's worth obviously listening to the healthcare professionals, but getting a couple of opinions. And then secondly, give things time. Sometimes it might just be that you have to sit out for a year, and then you might be able to come back in a gentle way. So, don't give up. The other comment I make is, Matt Givon said this, and so did PJ, how you deal with your rehabilitation really is a strong pointer to how you're going to come out of things. I mean, I picked up some things that you said about how diligent you were and how you were starting to push yourself mentally and physically to come out of your rehabilitation. PJ and Matt said exactly the same things. So I think there's a common trait there in people who have good recoveries, is that they're mentally tough and they set a goal for themselves and they go about doing what they need to do to recover.
I totally agree with that. I didn't want to be in the hospital another day, not because the people weren't nice or the healthcare professionals, but it was a thing for me. It was my goal to get out. Now, I will tell you that my best friend told me, okay, you pushed hard to get out of the hospital. Don't push harder to get back in it.
Yeah.
So there's a fine balance there, but I totally agree. If you take it serious, I go to physical therapy and occupational therapy. I take it serious and everything else. They can sometimes see the sweat on your brow and everything else. They're like, you want to take a break? No, I don't want to take a break. I want to do this the right way. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So it's an immense story. And again, thank you for sharing. I've enjoyed meeting. And so it's great to meet someone who's supporting me and very appreciative of that. But the story you shared, and also I found out a bit about you as a diver. So it's great to know that. I would love to dive with you sometime. So if we don't pull that off in New Zealand, then we'll make a point to meet up in Florida or somewhere, or maybe in California. You probably don't know this. I used to live in San Clemente. So I was only like an hour's drive away from you on the way to Catalina Island as well. So look, who knows? Maybe we'll meet in Dana Point, go for a dive and have a beer afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be great. I really appreciate meeting you and talking to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Matthew.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I learned a lot by talking to Mathieu about COVID-19 and about his experiences. It's both frightening and also awe-inspiring to see how he dealt with this infection and now is recovering and getting himself back into diving. If you'd like to know more about how you can support Speaking Sidemount, then please go to www.patreon.com/speakingsidemount, where you'll find all of the reward levels and also some of the awesome benefits that you can get, including premium episodes, bonus videos, live streams, and your chance to be like Matt and join me on the show as our VIP Patron of the Month. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll catch you in the next episode of Speaking Sidemount. You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.